Hello, I'm Dr. Jose Herrera, and in this short video, I'm going to show you the basic anatomy of the central nervous system. Well, first, the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of the extensions of the central nervous system. The central nervous system includes the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the spinal cord, plus a few scary sounding structures situated between the brain and the cerebrum. These are the diencephalon, which includes everything with the name thalamus, for example, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the subthalamus, and the basal ganglia, which includes the caudate nucleus, the globus pallidus, the putamen, claustrum, and the amygdala. Well, cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest component of the brain and is divided into right and left hemispheres. The corpus callosum is a collection of white matter fibers that joins these hemispheres together. Each of the cerebral hemispheres is further divided in 4 lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The frontal lobe is distinguished from the parietal lobe posteriorly by the central sulcus. The frontal lobe and the parietal lobes are divided inferiorly from the temporal lobe by the lateral sulcus. The parietal lobe is distinguished from the occipital lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus. Well, cortex and subcortical fibers. The outermost layer of the cerebrum is the cortex, which has a slightly gray appearance, and it has a folded structure. Each fold is termed as gyrus, while each group between the fold is termed sulcus. Below the cortex are axons, which are long fibers that connect neurons. Well, the limbic system. The limbic system is a grouping of cortical and subcortical structures involved in memory formation and emotional responses. The limbic system allows for complex interactions between the cortex, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus, and the brainstem. The limbic structures conventionally include the amygdala, the hippocampus, the fornix, the mammillary bodies, the cingulate gyrus, and the parahippocampal gyrus. The hippocampus likely allows the long-term memory encoding in the cortex and allows short-term memory retrieval. The amygdala appears to be involved in mediating the emotional aspects of memory, especially fear responses. The basal nuclei. The basal nuclei comprise the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, the subthalamic nucleus, and substantia nigra. The basal nuclei play a crucial role in modulation of movements. Certain movement disorders can be traced to pathologies in the basal nuclei, the most notable being Parkinson's disease, which is related to deficiencies of dopaminergic cells in the substantia nigra. The thalamus. It is positioned between the brainstem and the telencephalon. The diencephalon is composed of the thalamus, the epithalamus, the subthalamus, and the hypothalamus. The thalamus serves as a relay station for sending input to the cortex and receives information from each of the cardinal senses, except for smell. It serves as a gating function in filtering information. The cortex. The neocortex is the most developed structure of the human brain, as compared with the brains of other species. The complex patterns of folding allows an increased cortical surface to occupy a smaller cranial volume. Fortunately, the pattern of folding that forms the sulcal and gyral patterns remains highly preserved across individuals. This enables a nomenclature for the cortical anatomy. The left and right cerebral hemispheres are separated by the longitudinal cerebral fissure. Each cortical hemisphere can be divided into 4 lobes: frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. The frontal lobe can be distinguished from the temporal lobe by the lateral sulcus or sylvian fissure. The frontal lobe can be distinguished from the parietal lobe by the central sulcus or Rolandic fissure. The parieto-occipital sulcus, which is visible on the medial aspect of the hemisphere, divides the parietal and occipital lobes. While the frontal lobe can then further be divided into superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. which are divided by the superior and inferior frontal sulci respectively. Similarly, the temporal lobe is divided into the superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri, which are separated by the superior and inferior temporal sulci. Well, brainstem and cranial nerves. The brainstem is the most ancient part of the brain structurally. It can be divided into medulla oblongata, the pons, and midbrain. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that function mainly to convey motor signals and sensory information from the head and neck. The cranial nerves are as follows. First, we have the olfactory nerve that relays information from the nerves of the olfactory epithelium. Second, we have the optic nerve, which relays information from the retina. Third, we have the oculomotor nerve, which is principally involved in the control of eye movements. Fourth, we have the trochlear nerve, which innervates the superior oblique muscles of the eye. The sixth nerve is the abducens muscle, which innervates the lateral rectus muscle of the eye. The fifth nerve is involved in conveying sensory information from the face and also in controlling the muscles of mastication. Vascular compression of the branches of the trigeminal nerve has been associated with some types of facial pain, including trigeminal neuralgia. The seventh nerve is the facial nerve. It's principally involved in facial expression and also plays a role in tearing, salivation, and taste. The eighth nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve and is a purely sensory nerve that conveys auditory information, and the vestibular branch conveys information about head position and movement from the inner ear to the brainstem. The ninth nerve is the glossopharyngeal nerve and is involved in taste and salivation. The 10th nerve is the vagus nerve that conveys visceral sensation to the brainstem and also controls some visceral functions such as heart rate and gastrointestinal motility. The 11th is the accessory nerve, which innervates the neck muscles involved in head turning. And lastly, the 12th nerve is the hypoglossal nerve and is a motor nerve that innervates muscles of the tongue. The cerebellum occupies the posterior fossa of the skull. It is involved primarily in modulating motor control to enable precisely coordinated body movements. Similar to the cerebrum, which has gyri and sulci, the cerebellum has finer folia and fissures that increase the surface area. The cerebellum has two hemispheres connected by a midline structure called the vermis. In children, the cerebellum is a common location for tumors. And in adults, the posterior fossa is a very common location for metastatic tumor. Well, let's talk about the meninges. The meninges consist of three tissue layers that cover the brain and spinal cord: the pia, arachnoid, and the dura mater. The innermost of the three layers is the pia mater, which tightly covers the brain itself. Outside the pia mater is the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is a thin web-like layer between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. Is a space called the subarachnoid space, which contains cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. This space is where the major arteries supplying blood to the brain lie. If a blood vessel ruptures in this space, it can cause a subarachnoid hemorrhage. The outermost meningeal layer is the dura, which lies between the interior of the skull. And let's talk about microscopic anatomy. Well, the specific cellular patterns of the cortex are not uniform throughout the cerebral cortex, and their variation was mapped by Brodmann. The Brodmann areas represent cytoarchitectural differences across different brain regions, and the numbering scheme developed by Brodmann is still used to refer the distinct areas of the cortex. Some of the earliest contributions to modern language mapping can be traced to the work of Paul Broca, who studied the language deficits in patients with stroke. Broca's area, as it is termed, is a region of the frontal lobe which also overlaps with Brodmann area 44 and 45, responsible for speech production. Selective damage to this region leads to difficulty speaking, but typically with preserved comprehension. In contrast, the Wernicke's area refers to the posterior aspect of the superior temporal gyri, which overlaps with the Brodmann area 22. This region is generally responsible for speech comprehension, and selective injury to it can lead to impaired understanding with preserved speech production. The primary motor cortex corresponds with the precentral gyrus, or Brodmann area number 4. The primary sensory cortex corresponds with the postcentral gyrus, or Brodmann areas 1, 2, and 3. The primary visual cortex corresponds to the Brodmann area 17 and occupies the occipital pole. And finally, the primary auditory cortex lies on the superior bank of the superior temporal gyrus and corresponds to Brodmann area number 41. The auditory association cortex of Brodmann is Brodmann area number 42 and surrounds the primary auditory cortex. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to see you tomorrow in the course. Thanks.